And the use of the snow in the film, to me, was very different, and it was part of the a Kurdish aesthetic that means more to Kurds than Turks. And I think the subject of the next presentation is the role of landscape in Yilmaz Guney's films, that we get into not only his ideology but also his visual aesthetics.
Thank you. Yeah, this is my talk is maybe a little bit out of left field, considering that Guney is most talked about as kind of a political filmmaker, and his journey from being movie star to this very conscious sort of political figure. But I was watching The Hungry Wolves last week, and I really thought that what he is a kind of extreme landscape artist. And I'll explain what I mean by that. When you think of landscape artist, of course you think of painting. The landscape is this still image that we contemplate. Well, in film, of course, the landscape is not just something that's contemplated. It's a space that the characters move through. It influences the actions of the characters, and in some films, it's kind of a character in its own right. It's a very active space, a vibrant space. So, if you think about, say, John Ford's westerns, the American West, the way he captured that on film. Ho Xiaoshen, the Taiwanese filmmaker who frames his landscapes in the style of Chinese landscape painting. Or Terrence Malick, who kind of imbues the landscape with this almost spiritual presence that you feel throughout the film. They're all masters of sort of framing landscape in this almost distanced way, but I think of Guney as being part of a different tradition in which the landscape is almost malevolent or dangerous. And I think of directors like Raoul Walsh or Akira Kurosawa. If you think of the rain throughout Rashomon, or the mud scene, the battle in the mud in Seven Samurai, or maybe even more so Werner Herzog, who claimed he directed landscapes in the same way he directed people or animals, and who sees nature as this sort of malevolent entity he has to wrestle with. So in the film you saw tonight, Hope, for instance, I mean, this is a film about people not only going mad in the heat, but being driven mad by the sun and being driven mad by the land around them. Where Terrence Malick sees this sort of spiritual presence in the landscape, Guney sees this destructive force that eventually kind of destroys the characters. And again, as you were mentioning in The Hungry Wolves, it's the same thing, and this is kind of what got me thinking about him in this way. I mean, the film is filmed in black and white. It takes place entirely in this snowy landscape, so the figures are these almost insignificant little black marks on this vast white landscape. And then not only that, but the snow, because it's movable and changeable, becomes a character in the film itself. Its substance is integral to the plot. From the Guney's character has built this kind of igloo that he lives in, and he can kind of poke holes in it when he needs to shoot somebody, so even walls are kind of permeable thanks to this substance. And yet, actually, in the end, he tunnels through the snow to get at the bad guys. So I think Hungry Wolves and Hope are both kind of the most interesting landscape films for him, because just as Guney, the director, directs the films and sort of sculpts the images, Guney, the character, shapes the landscape in the snow, literally, tunneling through the snow, building a house out of snow, changing the way the landscape looks through his actions and molding it to his advantage. And of course, in other films like The Herd, the landscape is a major part of it, or in Elegy, as Erju pointed out, this landslide at the end of the film, which we're actually showing this coming Sunday, so you can see the famous rock slide of in Elegy. And even films that he films in Istanbul. I was thinking of The Poor, which we showed last week. The city is this very action-filled landscape. He films it in this very vibrant, kind of visceral way. So he's very attuned to the environment around him in all his films, whether he's in nature or whether he's surrounded by buildings. So I started wondering, why he has this particular kind of sensibility for the world around him. And I started thinking, well, maybe as this fugitive outsider, who was frequently actually on the run, I think, from the authorities, has to pay attention to his environment and his landscape in this very specific way. He has to be aware of everything, of any threat that might emerge. It means something different to him than it means to us, who just kind of, don't have to worry about these things. He senses the environment around him in a different way. And it also means something to someone like Guney, who spent time in prison. I think if you spend years in prison, any time that you're out of prison, the world around you, the open world around you, takes on a different kind of energy. And I think his sensitivity to that kind of comes through in these films. We can take it for granted, but I don't think he could. And so he channeled that feeling for the land and the landscape that he perhaps longed for in prison into his films. So, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Actually, now I'm trying to, in a way, wrap this up in a sort of a graphical fashion, so that you can locate Guney in the kind of filmmaker he is. Of course, he's known as Çirkin Kral to the Turks and Pasha Nashrin, to the Kurds, and to the Ugly King. Of course, he wasn't like a matinee idol. And he lived a very short life, and as you've seen that, he was born in Yenice, somewhere in the Mediterranean coast between Adana and Mersin, but his father is from Siverek, and his mother is from the state of Mush, Varto. He is an assimilated Kurd, and his father did speak Zaza, and his mother speak Kermanchi. Even though he said Kurdish was spoken in his home, he wasn't very conversant in Kurdish, and he left his family when he was only 15 years old, and his 47 years of short life ended up in Paris. Now, this series of 8 films, they toured 10 important urban centers, and actually it was, the response was quite well in 3 locations in Canada, and this is his last leg. And if you ask the question whether his films well represented his oeuvre as a director, yes, in the initial part, there was films he directed and he also acted in, Elegy Hope, Hungry Wolves, and Bride of Earth. And then he made a film in a very short period called Friend, and the other last 3 films was directed when he was in prison in Proxy. This was a semi-open prison. He almost had a film office in there. He can see the dailies and the rushes. And the films had like a signature from the directors, the Proxy directors, but of course it was a connecting theme by Yilmaz Guney. And basically, when he escaped from prison, don't imagine it like he didn't scale walls or anything. He got a leave for a day, and then he walked out. As a matter of fact, this was the same subject that he tried in one of his early films that he acted. A prisoner gets a leave from the prison and decides not to return. And then we can see that we discussed some of these issues. Some of these films, he had the rural heroes. Of course, he was a very iconic character when he acted in it, with his gun and everything, and the banditry that is the way of life in these eastern parts of Turkey. And then he tried similar themes in the films that are basically urban dilemmas, whether they are well-to-do engineers in The Friend, or the really downtrodden in the poor ones, or the one we see in Umut, like the very poor people who try to make a living. He goes back to these themes, and even they become also icons, that the same subject he tries again and again. These films, sometimes they don't look like they're coming from the same director, but what ties them all together, that his way of discovery and using this very powerful medium in making these films, he's enjoying it, and he finds that this is very, it's a medium that he can really express himself. So he's in a constant search. And because of this, some people might consider certain films as his best films, but now the other films do fill in the blanks. And normally when you see them in its entirety, you try to recognize things that are not that obvious to us. Now, here's the double life he was living. You can see that in his 47 year of life, he made the films. On the top of the chart, the reds represent when he was in prison. Now, the reason that put him into prison are not related to his filmmaking, and there's a little green area that he was doing his military service, and then in the last period when he was in exile. So this is, how he made these films are by itself, it's amazing. When he was in the military service, he used this weekend leaves to make a couple of films in this period of time. And again, when he was in prison, he did write some of the screenplays that you can see here, and some of the directors tried their hand, and they were, again, part of his oeuvre, but we can see that his output and the number of films he made obviously was affected by the time he did spend in prison. Some people call him the most incarcerated director in the world, but again, the reason that put him in the prison are not directly related to his filmmaking, but you must realize that during this time, his life was straddled between a couple of coups, and this was the Cold War and the sort of the communist scare, and some of his arrest was maybe going beyond the reality of authorities might felt that he was kind of a threat, but his activities were not related to filmmaking that put him behind prison bars. So, but again, at the period, during his prison, it was very productive. So with these proxy directors, he was garnering awards like the Herd and the Yol. Yol did share the grand prize in Cannes Film Festival, and the Herd won not only the British Film Minister Award, but also the Golden Leopard in Switzerland. In concluding, I don't want to go into details, but basically we have to bear in mind that Guney was in a search for identity, and we can discuss it with your questions. He was also in search for language, because in some of his films, especially Herd, he said afterwards, if he was given the choice, he would like to be able to make them in Kurdish. I mean, today people can make films in Kurdish, and the last Istanbul Film Festival, they had 3 films talking about Kurdish identity, and they were made in Kurdish, so it's not an issue now. But during his time, being able to bring a language to his own people that he's also discovering through these films was very important to him. And again, his ideology, he wasn't what you might call a Kurdish ideologist. His ideas was more for everyone, for the Turk, for the Kurd, for the Arab, to have these socialist ideas and the type of freedoms that he is seeking for. Again, ethnicity, you can see the characters, but you never know and talk about them as Kurdish or a minority or someone else. He basically tries to reach them by showing them. Of course, he had revolutionary ideas, but as we know, as we watch them, we can recognize his search for a film language and the new aesthetic of maybe a Kurdish aesthetic that a lot of Kurdish filmmakers are following him, apart from filmmakers in Germany like Fatih Akın and many young Turkish filmmakers. Even though for a period of time they couldn't see the films of Yilmaz Guney, now they are rediscovering him and making the basis of a new emerging filmmaking in Turkey. Thank you very much. If you have some questions, I think we can take. Would you like to moderate questions? Or?
You know, my name is Doğan, and by the way, I wanted to thank you for being here and providing this opportunity for everybody to understand Yilmaz Guney. More than so, actually, his ethnic and social background. I believe that what he tried to do in his films are not necessarily the way you describe it, as if he was an assimilated Kurd, but I find it that he directly emphasized his Kurdish identity in his films. And it shouldn't be interpreted as just because his means of communication and using language was Turkish, that does not necessarily make him a Turkish individual. Coming to the socio-political environment, during the time that these movies are made, one thing that you have to pay attention is that in terms of, I believe, sorry that I forget your name, and you put in a context of failed state, and you distinguish the military from that portion as if this military was not truly a failed institution, whereas what we come to see today is that most failed institution was the military, because military was means of oppressing all these ethnic communities and forced migration that come to these metropole areas to have this life that Guney find in his background and try so hardly to interpret it as a experience that many other social class of different ethnic backgrounds also experience. So with that, I wanted to, not in a way of asking question actually, to provide this different unique perspective from a perspective of an individual, myself, who is a Kurdish and comes from distinctly from the area that Yilmaz Guney come from. And this is what I've seen. All our families has been forced into migration, and we have been forced into the metropole cities of this one nation state that is called Republic of Turkey, failed state in that sense during the time of the 70s. And when you come to define once again those military takeovers, and they were actually, interestingly enough, come around the time that Turkish people demand some sort of rights, justice, and coexistence for that matter. So I do appreciate for your contribution, but hope that you consider from looking at this perspective as well. Thank
if you. I can add to your comment is, at the time when he was making all these films, let me explain something about Turkey. In Turkey, there are and there were always people who made films, but they didn't have a film industry like we have in the United States or in France or in Germany. The films were made by having advances from different distribution areas. And Yilmaz Guney was not even considered an actor whose films could play in Istanbul. So the Istanbul distributors didn't pay for his films to play. And then they realized that he was very popular in other parts of Turkey. So even though today Istanbul is the largest Kurdish city in the world, for a Kurdish actor to be accepted in Istanbul took some time. But again, in those days, Yilmaz Guney, whether he was a director or an actor, the films had to make money in a certain box office. So if you know the Kurdish background, if you understand the Kurdish aesthetic, and if you understand the Kurdish stories, you could find them in the films, but they're not overtly presented. So they were always there. And today we know more about this, and we appreciate these films, and that's why we're trying to see them again. And interestingly, why these films made to North America was a certain newspaper in Turkey, they are pressed like this. They said, the Turkish Ministry of Culture do not even have one Yilmaz Guney film. And the Ministry of Culture said, no, it's not true. We have 12 films. And this is the first time the Ministry of Culture, with new prints, distributed these films by saying that, look, we're in a situation and we're in a period that we can talk about these films, we can discuss about